Hello, everybody. We're going to get started. Welcome to the Cooper Union School of Architecture. I'm Benjamin Aranda, and it's my privilege to introduce tonight's event. We have a unique pairing of lectures. The format is going to be two short lectures, followed by a conversation between Zachary Mollica and Valerie Trouet. And I'm so excited to dive in. Trees connect us. They provide more than nourishment and shelter. They intertwine our histories. Tonight, we'll hear from two individuals whose work in their respective fields is groundbreaking and whose work shows how we are all connected. Zachary Mollica is an architect, maker, and educator known for his innovative work with trees. His work has become a reference for alternative wood building and combines unique techniques, things like 3D scanning with traditional craftsmanship. Mollica teaches at the University of Toronto Daniels Faculty of Architecture through a pedagogy of wood-focused, hands-on teaching and research, and as he calls it, applying tools of close observation. His goal is to spur, quote, a re-diversification of wood building methods. He explores how low-value forest products can be transformed into high-value building components. And one of his notable projects that you may have heard of is the Tree Fork Truss, a large-scale structural piece created at Hook Park, where Mollica served as its warden. And he also founded the AA Wood Lab, the Architectural Association Wood Lab. We invited Zach to Cooper Union to showcase his work, Other Wood Pieces, which is on view in the hallway on the third floor. It features 24 carefully honed tree parts, parts that maybe are overlooked or discarded, and reveals their inherent structural and tactile qualities. This intimate series allows us to really experience these exquisite forms of a tree close up. I want to just quickly say thank you to Chris Sturks and Stephen Hillier from the exhibitions and Dean Haley Ebert for making this possible, along with Shervin, Jamali, Mauricio Higuera, and all the students whose work went into mounting the show. Also just want to say, please stick around afterwards. We're having a reception for the exhibition across the street, the third floor of the foundation building. Valerie Trouet, it is such an honor to have you here. Thank you so much for coming. Valerie Trouet is a professor of dendrochronology at the University of Arizona and currently serves as the scientific director of the Belgian Climate Center. She's also referred to as a dendroclimatologist, dendro, tree, chronology, time. She studies tree rings to uncover the climate's past and its impact on ecosystems and human history. Her research spans climatic variability over the last 2,000 years, exploring atmospheric circulation patterns, extreme climate events, and the terrestrial carbon cycle. These ideas and more are covered in her book, my summer reading, Tree Story, The History of the World Written in Rings, which has been translated into 7 languages. Valerie is a Kavli Fellow of the National Academy of Sciences and received an honorary doctorate from the Wageningen University in 2023. Before I welcome them to the stage, I just want to share a quick story about how trees connect us. So years ago, I heard about Zach and his work through my cousin, Florencia Rodriguez, who traveled from Chile to study at Hook Park under his guidance. And it always kind of remained, his work always kind of remained in my mind. And then when Zach and I were discussing his exhibition here, he mentioned that a conversation with Valerie Trouet would be his dream. By chance, Valerie happened to be in the same part of the world during this time of this lecture. She likes to keep a low carbon footprint with travel, as might be obvious. And as fate would have it, both of us have personal ties to Tucson. And in a way, You could say that the world is small. Tucson is especially small. But when I learned that the founder of the field of dendrochronology was an astronomer in Tucson, a story from this book, from Valerie's book, I really felt like it was more than a coincidence. It felt to me like trees were at work here, connecting us through their own network. So this is the story of trees tonight. I'm so excited and humbled for our guests. Please join me in welcoming Zachary and Valerie to the stage.
Hey, well, thank you, Ben. Thank you, Valerie, for coming. Thank you, everyone, for, being here and for having me. It's really an honor to be back. Not back, but to be at the Cooper Union. I say back because I feel a little bit like I'm back at the AA, but that's for all sorts of reasons to talk about. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to have shipped a bunch of my favorite bits of wood to you all. So thank you for taking care of them, and please feel free to touch them later. Otherwood Pieces as an exhibition starts on a short section of an oak post that stood, I figure, in an Ontario barn for at least 100 years. Presenting over 300 annual rings, that means this tree started growing in at least the 1600s. Those are the time scales that we're starting the evening from. The loop is there. You're all welcome to a closer look. My own engagement with trees is rooted in wonder. Here are the oldest living beings whose bodies are self-optimizing, self-repairing structures that embed the environmental systems they require for life. What an impressive building they would be. Trees and their relatives terrestrialize the earth, their rings record the planet's history, and their products have been critical to every moment of human technological development. To start, I'm Zach. I'm not a carpenter, but I have worked with many. I'm not a forester, but I've spent time along with trees. I'm not a researcher, but I do research. Most importantly, I am not an architect, but I teach architecture. I enjoy observing and reacting to materials around me, and hopefully a lot of that will start to build this evening. When we build with wood, using just a few species in just a few formats, we directly contribute to simplifying forest ecosystems around the world. That's not a good thing. If instead of this, we could re-diversify the ways that we build, we could actively encourage and use building as a tool to get back towards healthier systems. My work is centered on saying that digital tools have a strong role to play in that process. Those that know me will know that my camera roll has a lot of photos of trees on it. I'll stop people often on walks to take them. I'm interested particularly in how they grow, but also how they fall down, and along the way, how their products can be used. In 2 slides, I'd like to convince you in short that wood is much, much, much more capable than we tend to give it credit for in a modern building perspective. Before diving in, I want to note that I'm not possibly going to be able to thank everybody who should be thanked in the projects that come. This work has been supported by so many, and honestly, just a countless procession of people that came before me who I have no idea of. But it's work that sits within a very long history. But the short history starts here. In 2014, I landed in Hook Park. Hook Park is a 350-acre working forest that's occupied by the Architectural Association, the School of Architecture, as a very unusual second home. A particularly unusual second home for a school not frankly known for building too many things. For 7 years, I got stuck in Hook after intending to be there for 1.5. In that time, we went through COVID, we built a whole ton of things, and in 2018, I really had the privilege to lead this site. Arriving in 2014, that wasn't really on my horizons. And so I'm very grateful for many that made that happen. Though my whole life has been incredibly woody, the work I'll share tonight starts from an obsession in 2015 with tree forks. Started in Hook and really spiraled there to what I'm presenting tonight. The structure that Ben mentioned is this one. In 2015, myself and student colleagues working on our MArcs built a 25-meter spanning structure made of tree forks. I probably wouldn't do it again exactly as we did it, but it started a series of projects that emerged at Hook and I think honestly has started to infect workbenches elsewhere. The structure is 25 meters, uses 20 distinct forks, and rises to about 8.5 meters in its middle. The work itself is facilitated by new tools, 3D scanning and robotics, but it comes out of a much older way of thinking about trees. This image from the Encyclopédie Méthodique shows naval timbers being cut or sketched out to be cut within old trees. And so when we started this project, the first thing we needed to know was what shape they are. To design with their form, we documented 200 forks around the forest by photographing standing trees. We selected 25 of these for harvest, 30 if you include the 5 that broke on their way down, and 3D scanned each of them in great detail. We wrote programmatic scripts that would help us to shuffle these forks around and help each to find the place in the structure that it best fit, what its form wanted to do. We're then helped by a robotic arm to cut joints that are sympathetic to these arrangements and to the forms of the trees. With all pieces cut, the structure was pre-assembled over the course of 2 months on the left, and then craned into place in just 2 days, standing fully assembled on site. It became, honestly, in a way that none of us understood when we were working on it, a key reference in a space of alternative wood building that is shaped up. It comes from the forest that's beyond and is contrasted by the sawn timbers above it. In the years since, I'm really proud to say that there has been a lot of weird wood on both my and many other designers and students' tables. And that together, and this is the key bit for me, together these projects point a path towards rediversifying building. Rather than heading for a next great thing, we're headed for a future in which many, many processes can coexist. In other wood pieces, I've taken the opportunity to engage with some of the many more forms of tree that I think we could use in these projects. This was an incredibly fun box to pack up as a crate. There's a rhino model that shuffles it all around, but essentially it's an absurd little collection, all wrapped in paper, indexed, and with a shipping manifest that thankfully got through the border. The exhibition includes 24 of my favorite pieces of uncommon wood that are from 13 species. Each of them has been obsessively prepared, ranging from about a 400 grit sandpaper to 4,000. And the collection is presented not as finished objects, but as raw materials for others to think about in their own design projects. Alongside these pieces, I've shared a few large format drawings that are currently still in process. What started off as a sketch on a single piece of graph paper has grown to be 4 pieces of A2 that I really would encourage you all to interrogate as we get back. The drawing tree relations aims to map out familial relations among trees, looking for property characteristics that are similar. The other wood pieces are organized under 3 main sections. In my time remaining tonight, I want to share a few of the stories, where they're from, how I've worked on them, and why I think that they matter. The first of these, and where this project all started, was in thin forest products. So you'll see, I'm going to present a lot of this around photos of the exhibition that we'll go to visit. And so most of what we see is large straight chunks of wood. We take cylinders, we cut rectangular prisms, we forget that everything else exists. None of these are that. There's 7 distinct shapes of small diameter tree, mostly American beech in this case. I believe that if we can find ways to work with younger trees, we can safeguard elder trees. There's a lot more that I don't have time to speak to tonight of why that's a good thing, but the bigger the trees that we can keep standing, the better for our ecosystems. In 2023, I had the opportunity to bring a truck full of these trees back to the University of Toronto and had 12 students join me for a 10-day adventure, basically designing and making for 10 days straight without pause. We got in a lot of trouble at certain moments for trying to use tools in the shop that they weren't familiar with. But ultimately it resulted in some fabulous work. And so you'll see the progression from the trees in a U-Haul truck coming south to a layout of hand tools and many of the trees that we worked on. Matthew, thankfully, has allowed me to use this photo often on our lounge chair. On day one, every student made a mallet. Small mallets were used to make bigger mallets, and eventually we had a very, very big mallet. It's one of the best assignments I've ever given. Days 2 to 10 were still pretty good, but not quite as good. Days 2 to 4, we set about small seats using no metal fasteners if we could. So all of these pieces are made purely from wood, doweled together and assembled. And from days 5 to 10, we finally planned pieces out, with my favorite piece being a lounge chair that follows the exact curve of a piece of wood that acts as a spine. Coming out of the summer, we had a lot of wood left from that truck. And so leftovers from this workshop were used by one of my thesis students this past year to develop a new column typology. Zen, in his thesis, Inverting the Unwanted, effectively turned a log inside out. And for me, grappled with a really important idea, which is these structures can't just be knobbly forever if we're going to actually take over conventional building practices. And so in this move, Zen creates a flat datum. The second panel is wood that I've found in the city, because eventually I left the forest. This second panel includes salvage boards, a few thick portions of street tree, and our family's Christmas tree from 2 years ago on the far right. These show just a few of the many sources of good wood you'll find in the city if you're looking. Leaving Hook Park, frankly, posed a challenge. Without a forester, or a forest to hand, opportunism has been essential because I don't get to just go and cut down trees anymore. In Toronto, instead, I'm constantly looking for new material and finding willing participants. Two of the pieces that present are old growth pieces of timber from 2 species. These old growth pieces are immensely valuable. Ideally, they probably shouldn't have been cut down in the first place in the way that we did, but having done so, all of them warrant more use. There's a lot of work, it's not easy, but these woods are tougher and stronger, they're more subtle to touch, and honestly just have infinitely more interesting characteristics than what we've come to expect from Home Depot SPF. And yet this is where they were found. In the corner of a grocery store parking lot, a builder had heaped a bunch of stuff that luckily I spotted one day and realized there were some very heavy bits of wood, suspiciously so. Each has been plenty strong to warrant another use, and they were brought to school, although nobody should tell our IT department, they were brought to school for further study, looking to scan initially their rings of growth to understand the relative stories that these trees had lived. Importantly, the much smaller tree also was a much slower growing and older piece of wood. There's a lot to say, but for me, it's become a fascination starting out of some of these pieces. And I think a lot of why having Valerie here was a real privilege today, to be able to speculate as an amateur on the life of that tree from nothing more than a cross section cut through it. For the last 2 years, and I hope to take a break this year, I've deconstructed our annual Christmas tree in exhaustive detail. Last year, I went further than the first year and separated stem, branch, and needles. I had help, thankfully, over the course of my first exhibition, but found it notable in the end that the needles of this Christmas tree actually outweighed either the twigs or the stem of it. Although that's not a perfect exemplar to assume applies to a full-scale tree, it was incredibly interesting that the dry weight of the needles was more than either constituent part. The overall numbers I've then used to do what, particularly in the presence of a scientist, I'm going to call bad math. An estimated 3 million Christmas trees are produced in Canada every year for domestic use. If 7.5% of Canada's population is in Toronto, I assume that 225,000 trees will be sold annually. Each is taken to weigh the 7 kilograms that the previous tree shown had weighed, and of this, 50% of the dry weight is carbon. Altogether, 787,500 kilograms of carbon then could be captured in our general language as designers. Converted to CO2 equivalent, adding the O2, this becomes 2,890,125 kilograms. And with Canadian emissions at 15,000 kilograms per person, we offset a whopping 192 Canadians if we take every single Christmas tree in the city of Toronto. This doesn't seem like the most effective approach. On volume, though, it becomes a much more interesting story. I had plans, thankfully, for the room that we're in tonight and was able to roughly estimate that all piled up, the needles from these Christmas trees would fill this room right to its ceiling 4 times. And so on volume, for me, that starts to become an interesting material to start to work with. Around the same time I was working on the start of this, one of my other thesis students, Samantha Tam, developed a project, What Does the Harvester Leave Behind? And the result here that I'd like to show as a bit of a provocation to these materials is magical little bricks that are made of spruce needles held together with only pine resin. No glue, no other products. Moving on, in the city trees is a large chunk of maple that's been split in 2. The outside of this is the most subtle piece to touch in the entire collection, and so I'd really encourage it. In 2022, we took a studio break to collect some tree bits from arborists working nearby. For anyone working on a project like this, go and ask. Most of them will be happy for you to take products as long as you get rid of them quickly. Cut in half, I was able to find why I believe this tree was cut down. No video? We'll go. Okay. Chainsawed in half, the piece revealed rot that was starting to form in the middle of this piece of wood. A Norway maple tree. This is not uncommon around the age that this tree would be, probably about 100 years. But it raises a really interesting point, which is this tree was not about to die and fall over. Instead, we start to cut down trees at this age because we lose faith. We think that tree will lose a part, that might wreck a car, it might hit a person. But it's important for us to start thinking of the ramifications, because Toronto, for example, is about to start losing a ton of these trees. This array, a drawing in the exhibition, engages with data from the city of Toronto by neighborhood. Column by column, my partner Sherry and I mapped out patterns in the data, trying to understand across 650,000 street trees what's common, what's native, what else is hidden in the data. And so finally, I get to the odds and ends set. These are 8 small pieces that along the way of cutting down a tree would usually be discarded. Each of them is a natural offcut of taking the main part that we want. And in presenting them here, I hope to demonstrate what could be the start of a nose-to-tail approach to cutting trees, a scenario in which we take each part and make things of value. At the center is a piece received from my grandfather, Jack. Lots of trees don't have cylindrical bases. When we cut them, most of that wood is chucked aside and we take the cylinder that was above it. But this piece with exquisite grain shows what can be taken from the buttress of a cedar. Taking a vertical slice through a similar piece reveals this flute slice slab. It's not very structural, it wouldn't be very strong, but its diagonal grain is exquisite, and it's another I would encourage everyone here to touch. For me, the work ultimately, and here I'm showing 4 more pieces that essentially are cuts through the branches, the warts, the little bits growing off the side of trees. But the work ultimately dreams of an approach to cutting down trees in which every single piece might be kept, thought about, and made into things of value at all scales, in all pursuits. Trees reduce erosion by their roots. They moderate their local climates. They absorb carbon dioxide from the air, process harmful pollutants, provide habitats for bugs and animals, share resources with other trees, importantly. Trees provide food to animals and to people. They provide wood for building and for fuel. They feature in almost all of our cultural mythologies, and trees, critically for this evening, record history within their annual rings. The sum of all of this is for me to say, we owe them much more than we tend to give them. The exhibition ends on 10 observations that I won't go through in this moment, but 10 observations that have been gained through the last bunch of years staring at wood and talking to people about these projects. Critical and central throughout each of them is to use technology well and to work with material that's very nearby. In the face of ecological and societal crisis, my personal aim and desire is to be part of fostering a cohort of new designers who will be resourceful in using available materials, nimble in applying the tools that are necessary, and aware of how much more work there is to do in all of these pursuits. When I'm not at school, this is where you'll find me. It's part garage, part studio. It's directly connected to our kitchen, and it serves many functions. It's a small room that has way too much stuff in it, but it's been obsessively organized and it's constantly useful. I really wish you could all have one. This is a list of people also featured in the exhibition that really includes those I have learned with, worked with, been inspired by, and had facilitate my ideas. It also includes many of those that have made this specific exhibition possible. I want to thank Ben, Dean Eber, Chris, Stephen, everybody who's helped to bring this together, and to the whole community for having me. Last up, I want to thank my partner, Sherry, who right now is at home, ideally with our daughter in Brooklyn, sleeping. Over to Valerie. I first heard Valerie on a podcast called The Fellowship of the Tree Rings that I would really encourage everybody to listen to. I was immediately captivated by an ability to seamlessly weave scientific procedure and captivated narrative. Quite rare. When Ben emailed in the middle of the summer to tell me that she could join, it made my day, I think, for both of us in short. And it's really just a pleasure to anticipate the conversation we can have. Too much of our conversation on wood is around boards, sheets, and how much carbon we can store. Too little is concerned with their immense variety and everything else they do. I feel privileged to share the stage tonight, and now want to sit down and listen. So thank you.
It is my absolute great honor to be here tonight. Thank you so much, Zach and Ben, for the introduction and the invite, and thank you everyone for attending. As Ben mentioned, I am a dendroclimatologist, which means that I study the rings in trees to reconstruct the climate of our past. Apart from it being a fascinating field of science, it also lends itself very well to science communication, because unlike faraway galaxies or some unknown enzyme, vast majority of people are familiar with the concept of what we do, meaning that trees form rings every single year. And that means that we can count those rings in order to determine the age of a tree. Quick hands up. Who here has, as a kid or an adult, bent over a tree stump to count its rings and get an idea of the age of the tree when it was cut down? All right. Vast majority of people. Great. What fewer people know is all the information we can extract out of those same tree rings. And this is what I'll give you a very short introduction of tonight. But first off, to put everyone on the same page, I'm going to show you a microscopic image of the tree rings that we saw earlier. So if you look at wood through a microscope, which I highly, highly recommend you to do, and you can get a head start by looking through the little lens in Zach's exhibit. This is what you see. So what you see here is a sequence of tree rings in a conifer, so in a needle leaf tree, with the center of the tree on your left and the bark here on the right. So I guess we're not talking to biologists. Trees grow from the inside out. So they put on a new ring right underneath the bark. So the oldest wood is in the center of the tree, and the youngest wood, the most recent wood, is right underneath the bark. And what you see here is one tree ring, another tree ring, another tree ring, another tree ring, and so forth. And so I'm going to focus on this tree ring here. What you see are wood cells. And you can see that this part, the light colored part, is called the early wood. And it's called early wood because it's formed early in the growing season. In spring, when the tree starts growing, it forms big cells that allow for water transport through from the roots to the leaves. Later on in the growing season, in summer, up until about September, the tree forms same wood cells, but they're much smaller and they have a much thicker cell wall. That's called the late wood, the wood that's formed late in the season. That's because at that point in time, the wood water transport is less important, and it's more important that the wood provides stability to the stem of the tree. And then around September, or maybe a little later, the tree stops growing altogether. So both needle-leaf trees and deciduous trees, they have, at least in temperate regions like ours and climate like ours, they have a dormancy period. They don't grow new wood or wood cells during winter. And then next spring, they start producing new wood cells again, but obviously they're early wood and they look very different from the late wood of the previous year. So what you're seeing when you're looking at tree rings is an abrupt transition between the late wood of one year, the dark colored late wood of one year, and then the light colored early wood of the next year. It's the biology of wood anatomy. That's in theory. Normally, all of that goes well each and every year. But every now and then you get a year that's a little extraordinary. What you're looking at here is now a photograph of these same tree rings. But this ring that you're looking at here is the ring of the year 536. And so this is one of my favorite photos, a bit of a tree ring nerd. It's taken from a tree that was alive in 536. It's a Mongolian pine tree, so it grows high in the mountains in Mongolia. Does anybody have any idea what happened in the year 536 that might have caused this ripple effect? In this and many other trees, I should say, this anomaly happened in many trees worldwide. Okay, I will let you know what it is. In 536, this has been recorded by the Romans, by the way, a volcanic eruption happened, a very dramatic and powerful volcanic eruption. We don't know exactly where, but it was probably somewhere in the tropics, and it probably erupted in the summer season. And so when a big volcano erupts, it spews sulfur and aerosols high up into the atmosphere, into the upper layers of the atmosphere. And if that happens in the tropics, those aerosols get spread out over the entire Earth's surface. It's kind of a veil that gets in the atmosphere that blocks sunlight from coming in. And so when that happens, these are big volcanic eruptions, the Earth cools down for 1 up to 4 years. Typically, you get a very noticeable temperature drop worldwide. And so when that happens in the summer, that means that the wood cells that were being formed in summer and that were transporting water at the moment of when that big temperature drop happened, if the temperature drop is such that it starts freezing in summer, you can get this effect. It's called a frost ring. It means that the water that was being transported at the moment of the frost freezes inside the wood of the tree. And so when water inside a wood cell freezes, you get the same effect as when you put a bottle of Coke in a freezer and leave it there for too long. It implodes. So basically what you're seeing here are imploded wood cells where the water inside of them has frozen and has expanded. And so we see these frost rings in the year 536 in various old trees throughout the entire Northern Hemisphere, which points us to the fact that it was a global event and not just a local frost event. I mentioned that, that was an old Mongolian pine, but that was not the oldest living tree on Earth. This is a bristlecone pine. It's not the oldest living tree, but it's also a very old tree. Oldest known living tree, it was 5,062 years old in 2012 when one of my colleagues at the University of Arizona sampled it. It's a bristlecone pine. These trees grow on the border, in the White Mountains on the border between California and Nevada. Many of them grow to be 4,000 plus years old. This is a photo of a bristlecone pine. It's still alive. As I mentioned, this is not the oldest. This is not a 5,000-year-old tree because that one, its location is kept secret, even for professional dendrochronologists. To avoid that, people take souvenirs of it. Now, obviously, very important to mention when we want to analyze 5,000 years old trees, we don't need to cut them down in order to do so. So our main instrument as a dendrochronologist is this. It's a hollow core. It's about a quarter of an inch in diameter, 20 inches in length. And you core it by hand into the tree, into the stem of the tree, and you can extract a pencil-sized piece of wood out of it that you can bring back to the lab. Doesn't damage the tree, doesn't hurt the tree. It's like drawing blood from a person. Bring all of those samples back to the lab where you put your students to work to sand them nicely to 400 grit or more. And that's when the tree rings pop out. And that's where then the real work of a dendrochronologist, what makes dendrochronology as a science and not just counting trees, starts. And then that's the process of cross-dating. I can give a whole lecture or multiple lectures just on how to do the cross-dating, but I'm not going to do that here. But to give you a sense of what it is that we do, we pattern match the width of rings between different pieces of wood. And to give you an idea of this, what you see here are 3 pieces of oak wood, 1, 2, 3, from 3 different historical buildings in England that were built at different times in different regions. But the trees from which these oak beams were cut clearly all grew at the same period, in the same period of time. So if you look here at this pattern of 3 wide rings with the same amount of narrow rings in between, it's an indication. Of course, we typically use much longer sequences of tree rings than that. That's an indication that these trees were growing under the same climate at the same time. Importantly, we're not limited when we do dendrochronology to living trees alone. We can date dead trees, we can date historical buildings, we can date archaeological wood, and even subfossil wood. And so putting all of these sources of wood together, the longest continuous tree ring chronology that exists is 12,650 years long. It's the German oak and pine chronology. And so that means that for each of these 12,650 years, we have a ring that's dated to the exact year, and we know the width of that ring. Now with that, that's my short introduction to dendrochronology. With that, I'm going to now move on to give some examples of the 3 main applications of dendrochronology. So one of them, so we study history using tree rings. We study human history, study climate history, and of course we work with trees and forests, so we also study forest history. give one quick example of human history, because this is not my field of expertise, but there is a very important application of dendrochronology in art history and archaeology. So what you're looking at here is a Miraflores triptych from one of the Flemish primitive painters, Zachary Mollica. A lot of the Flemish primitive painters painted on oak panels. And so Miraflores triptych, quite well known. I should notice that that Rogier van der Weyde lived from 1400 to 1464. So keep those dates in mind for the rest of the story. There's two copies of the triptych. One of them is in Berlin, and the other copy, one panel hangs here at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. The other two panels hang in Granada in Spain. And so from an art historical perspective, it was always assumed that the copy that was here at the Metropolitan Museum was the original that Van der Weyde painted himself, and that the Berlin copy was valuable and old, but was not painted by him himself. Was a copy made by his followers. Now then, some dendrochronologists got their hands on the oak panels that these paintings were painted on. And so when they date it, you can date the exact year in which the final ring occurred. When they did that for the Berlin copy, they found that the final ring was 1421, which was early in the life of Van der Weyde. So it's not proof that this is a real Van der Weyde, but it is possible that Van der Weyde painted that copy. You hear me coming, but when they dated the panel on which the copy that was here in the Metropolitan Museum was painted on, the most recent ring was 1482. So 20 years after Van der Weyde passed away, this tree was still alive and kicking. So that is evidence that it's literally impossible that Van der Weyde painted the copy that is here at the Metropolitan Museum. As you can imagine, that put the art historical world in a bit of a frenzy when that result came out. Okay. My field of expertise is climate history, equally controversial, I would say, but in a different way. So I'll also give one example there of work we did in 2015 using these trees, blue oaks. So a lot of what I'll be talking about from here on out is going to be about California. Blue oaks, you can see an example here. They grow to be about 500 years old. Some of the most drought-sensitive trees that I have ever worked with. There's not a dry year in California that goes by where every single blue oak forms a narrow ring. There's not a wet year that goes by where every single blue oak forms a wide ring. So they are a 500-year-long record of when California was dry and when California was wet. And so we decided to use the tree rings of those blue oaks to look at the snowpack of the Sierra Nevada mountains. So as I mentioned, we did a study in 2015. When California, I'll talk about it in a second. When California was going through a very severe drought from 2012 to 2017. One of the ways in which we knew the severity of the drought of the California drought was by looking at its snowpack in the Sierra Nevada mountains. So what you're looking at here are two satellite images, so taken from space, of the Sierra Nevada mountains in California. The snowpack, the white is the snowpack in California in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Both images are taken in late March. So California has a Mediterranean climate. It has a wet season that goes from about October to about late March. So these images are taken at the end of the wet season. So at late March, that you got 6 months of no precipitation, no rain coming, no snow coming. So on the left, you see the snowpack in 2010. Very average year. This is what a normal, a healthy snowpack should look like in the Sierra Nevada mountains. On the right, you can see the same time of year, same satellite image, but in 2015. So even just from looking from space, you can see how little snow there was in California in 2015. Now, this was all over the news because snowpack is really important in a Mediterranean climate. When you have no rainfall in summer, your snow, it's like a natural storage system of water. Even if there's no, in the valley, if there's no rain, you can still get water because your snow melts in spring, gets stored in winter, it melts in spring, and you have water access. Now, if there is very little snow, that means there's very little water in the lower lying areas in California as well. It was so bad in 2015 that they were mentioning that they're in the news that there had never been so little snow in California in the 80 years since they started measuring snow. Now, as a dendrochronologist, 80 years is not very impressive. So we came out and we did better than that. So we used those blue oaks to reconstruct the amount of snow now, not just over the past 80 years, but over the past 500 years. And so the graph that you're looking at has time on the horizontal axis with 500 years ago to your left and the present to your right. And the vertical axis is the amount of snow in the Sierra Nevada mountains each and every year over those past 500 years. Most recent year is 2015, and the dashed red line shows that snow level in 2015. And so what we showed in this paper is that 2015 wasn't just the lowest snowpack over the past 80 years, but over the past 500 years. And that made a splash, right? We were very efficient. We published this paper still in 2015, still during while this drought was ongoing, and it was big news. Why I'm showing this is because of the same page of the New York Times. They're talking about wildfires happening in California at the same time and how they got out of control, which brings us to the third application of tree ring research, which is a history of forests, and I'll specifically talk about the history of fire. Won't have time to talk about all of it, but I'm sure you've heard or you've noticed that even over the past 50 years, the amount of wildfires and the area burned every year has increased fivefold in California. And this is a pattern that you see throughout the American West. So you get more widespread fires, you get much more intense fires that are harder to fight than 50 years ago. Now, obviously, the drought that I mentioned, anthropogenic climate change, a hotter, drier climate contributes to a higher wildfire risk. Longer fire season, drier forests increase your wildfire risk. But that's not all there is to the story of increased wildfires. And actually, the other part of the story is what we can also study with tree rings. We know from tree rings that California actually has a very long history of wildfires, but the kind of wildfires that California had as part of their ecosystem, of the California forest ecosystem, is very different from the wildfires that we are experiencing today. So what you're seeing here is a ground fire. It's a photo of a ground fire, where the name says itself. It's a fire that stays close to the ground, that burns off the grass layer and the underbrush, but it typically leaves the mature trees alone. It kind of cleans out the forest every 5 to 10 years. And so, as I mentioned, it typically leaves the mature trees alone, as in it doesn't kill the mature trees, but it can damage. It can leave wounds in those mature trees. And so when I first moved to the U.S., my job was to travel up and down the Sierra Nevada mountains for months in a row to look for these kind of trees that had fire scars in them, that had survived multiple fires. And so you can see here, each of these layers, trees can't heal. The best they can do when they're wounded by a fire is to grow over it. So here you can see multiple layers. There were trees that had 30 or more fire scars in them that had survived more than 30 fires throughout their lifespan. This kind of research, you can't do it with a core. Here you have to chop down the tree, or in many cases it was stumps, which made life easier. But if, like for the tree, easier mostly. If you do that, so if you take a cross section of such a fire-scarred tree, you can see the scars very clearly, and using tree ring dating, you can put a date on each and every one of those scars. So here you can see a tree that was cut down in 1998, and between 1765 and 1889, it has survived 14 subsequent fires. You can even, by looking at the position of the wound within a ring, whether it's in the early wood or the late wood, you can even determine what season those fires occur in. Now, as I mentioned, I didn't do this work based on one tree, obviously. I collected about 2,000 samples, dated about 20,000 of these fire scars. And if you put all of that together into one big fire chronology for California, this is what you get for the Sierra Nevada mountains. So our chronology goes back to 1600 and then up to the present. And obviously, we found a strong correlation between fire and drought. The dry years, the fire years, big fire years happened when California was at its driest. But we found a very interesting other results as well. We found these three shifts in the fire regime. Most recent one at the beginning of the 20th century in 1905, one around 1865, around 1775. And the most recent one is actually quite well documented. The one in the early 20th century. It's when the Forest Service was established in California. So this is called the Smokey the Bear effect. Forest Service was established in the early 20th century with the mission to protect Western forests. They didn't know about fire history. The dendrochronology was not a field of research yet, as we do now. So their idea of protecting the forest was putting out each and every fire that they encountered. And so they're very effective at it. And you can see a severe reduction in the fires in the Sierra Nevada mountains after the establishment of the Forest Service. Now, this is what is contributing to the issues that we're dealing with now. Because if you go back to this slide that I showed earlier, you can see that up until 1889, this tree survived 14 fires, meaning there was a ground fire every 5 to 10 years that would clear out the underbrush and clear out the grasses. It would clear out the flammable material every 5 to 10 years, and then a new fire would happen. Now, after 1889, up until 1998, no fires, nothing. Not a single fire scar to be found because we've been so good at putting out these fires. But what happens when you put out all of these fires that clean out the forests, you get a forest that hasn't been cleaned out in 100 years. You get a massive amount of fuels that now when a fire happens, you get a big destructive fire and not just an innocent ground fire. So this is a project from Alan Taylor, my colleague, who did a repeat photography project, basically went back to the place where early touristic photos were taken. So this photo was taken of a forest in 1923 in California. You can see a park-like structure. By 2008, so 85 years of no fires, you can see how much denser, how much more fuel there is in the forest. And obviously now in 2012, when that forest then burns, it is not a ground fire. It is a fire that doesn't wound your adult trees, your mature trees. It's a fire that kills those trees, that reaches the canopy of your trees and demolishes your entire forest. Okay, I will just quickly mention that gave us the idea that the regime shift, the fire regime shift of 1904, the beginning of the 20th century, was caused by land use change. Gave us the idea that maybe those earlier shifts were also caused by land use change. And lo and behold, the 1865 shift happened right after gold was discovered in California, when the Europeans came into California by massive amounts of people, massive amounts of cattle that would graze away at those that underbrush and grasses. Mines were built, railroads were built, so your whole forest management changed. And then the first regime shift, any idea what might have happened around 1776 in California? I know that's also when something else important happened in the US, but that's not what I'm referring to here. California specifically. Oh, wrong direction. All right. This is shortly after the first Catholic missions were established in California. Catholic priests arrived in California in 1769, brought not only religion with them, but also many diseases to which the indigenous population had no resilience. And so the century following 1769, about 90% of the indigenous population of California was depopulated, which changed the fire regime as well, because the indigenous population did use fires in a small scale for hunting purposes, for productivity purposes. And if you take away 90% of that population, your fire regime changes as well. In short, and in conclusion, tree rings can inform us about the past, the present, and also the future of climate, of ecosystems, and of human systems, and how they are linked. If you want to hear even more and learn more about tree rings, as Ben mentioned, I've written a book about it intended for a broad audience. It's called Tree Story, and it's recently been translated in Chinese as well, as well as some Dutch and some other obscure languages. Thank you very much for your attention.
We're on? Yeah. Amazing. Thank you. That was amazing. I want to advocate also, I read that this summer, to really read Valerie's book, because there's just a lot more in there. And I think for a similarly wood obsessed person, or I like to assume that you're wood obsessed, you may be a bit more distant, but got to assume. It's just kind of magical. And I think for me speaks to this idea that I hope that my work keeps coming back to, which is like, we just owe these wondrous things more. It's an awkward territory to hear all of that and then think about cutting them down to make things. But for me, there's a resounding constant that we should do better things with the trees we cut. So thank you. Plan for tonight, we've got a bit of a discussion planned for which I've come ready to grill Valerie with questions that hopefully aren't just too selfishly my own interests. And then we'll have a Q&A that I think will be a chance to engage the audience. So please tell me to stop at the point that it feels self-indulgent. But I thought as a way in, I might just, and please do ask questions back as you want to, but as a way in, I wanted to ask you to start about what's something that most people have wrong about trees or wood.
Well, it's interesting that you assumed that I was equally obsessed with wood as you are, because most people assume that I'm obsessed with trees, which I'm not. I really like wood a lot more than I like. Well, not like. I find it more fascinating as a research topic. What people get wrong about trees, I think that a lot of people don't realize the microclimatic conditions that trees produce. So they produce obviously shade, they cool down, locally. That's why we like trees in urban environments, but they can also create not just temperature changes, but also changes in the rainfall regimes. So you can see this a lot in rainforests, for instance, where they create kind of local water cycles. And so when you deforest, you create drought as well, which then leads to a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy if you make the drought worse by cutting down the trees.
That's a really, not meant as a trick question, just a softball in to open up. I mean, it's so much of, I think, where with a carpenter's brain on, so much of part of what I'm interested to talk to you about is some of the just hows of various pieces. You showed one of the boring bits, and I must admit, I've been already looking at whether my research funds can buy me a tree coring bit back at Daniels. But I wondered if you could tell us just a bit more first about taking a core. Particularly, I'm interested in just how hard this is. Like, how long does it take to drill to the center of 1,000 years? And then critically, how do you actually pop it out?
Yeah. Well, how hard it is depends on the kind of tree that you core. It's not a coincidence that about 80% of the tree ring samples or the tree ring data that are publicly available are from softwoods, from coniferous trees. Not just because typically they get to be older than broadleaf trees, but also because they're way easier to core. The coring process, well, so it depends a lot on what type of tree you core. It depends a lot on, the oldest trees and the most climate sensitive trees typically grow on very steep slopes, which makes the coring a lot harder. It's often, not very practical to core. You can kind of tell from looking at the architecture of a tree, no pun intended, whether you're dealing with an old tree or not. There are clues to doing that. But then the hardest part is when you core and but you can't tell if a tree is rotten in the middle of or not. Of course, if it's rotten in the middle, the oldest rings are gone. So then you core into the tree after this much, you hit rot, and so all of your effort was for naught, and you take it back out. We typically take 2 cores per tree, sometimes 3. Typically on a field day, 30, 40 trees per stand, depending on how big your team is. And then, of course, the farther you travel to go get your cores, the more cores you want to get out of your day. So if you go, I went on a field trip to Siberia once and never again. But there, the days, it wasn't summer and the days were very long. And so we just kept coring because, you don't get to Siberia every day. How you get it back out? So it's a hollow core. It has a core bit, and then you put there's a spoon, a metal spoon that goes in, and it has a sharp edge, so you kind of kick off the end, and then you have to core it back out. I will say, in the most recent field trip I did, which was in 2022, one of my colleagues brought a battery-driven electric bore that he put onto the core with a drill bit, a specifically made drill bit, which made life a lot easier. But actually, not on our field trip, but a colleague actually broke his wrist by the backlash of that happening. So it's all, don't try this at home, I would say. Actually, the chainsaw bit, that's a whole other part. You definitely don't want to try that.
Absolutely. And the last one that was in my mind, I mean, many of us, when you put a nail in or drill a hole, you're afraid you're going to wound the tree or open it up to rot.
Yeah.
Are you doing anything chemically to kind of help most of these trees?
No, the trees typically have a very good mechanism. I don't know if I can show the slide that I showed with the fire scars, but you saw this where the scars were at. It was darker colored wood. That's because of the chemical reaction of the tree itself. So trees compartmentalize. When they're wounded, they shut off the area that is wounded chemically so that the whatever comes into the wound doesn't go further into the wood. So they're magnificent organisms. We don't plug typically because that just makes things worse. Because if you plug a wound, it's like putting letting oxygen. It's very similar to our skin. You kind of want to let oxygen to the wound to let it heal itself rather than plugging it, and then you create an anaerobic environment that's not good.
But so conceivably, when, for example, tree houses are built, that could be exactly what creates that problem, is actually kind of inserting something into it could be worse than having just left a hole.
Indeed, yeah.
Okay. That's new to me. Jumping a little, other than looking at bits of wood underneath a microscope, how have you developed your understanding and relationship with trees? So I think, like, selfishly thinking of my own experience, I'm thinking, have you made much with wood? Have you kind of carved pieces of wood? Is it a microscope purely relationship?
Yeah, when I retire, I will get into carpentry, but I haven't had much time. I spent so much time sanding cookies and sanding core. The cores is nothing. It's a whole, I mean, as you know, the whole cookies, and you need to sand them very finely. That part I don't enjoy that much. I do enjoy the looking through a microscope because you're looking through a microscope, and I only showed you a slide of a conifer, which is the most boring wood there is. Looking at an oak, which you can do in the exhibit, or a beech, or a nice broadleaf tree through a microscope, it's just beautiful. It's really stunningly beautiful. And so my job was, now that I'm a professor, I don't spend much time in the lab anymore, unfortunately, but my job was to look through a microscope at this beautiful material, and then to do the process of cross-dating, which is like solving a puzzle. It's trying to pattern match, and I could do it for hours. I mean, maybe that's what I'll do again when I retire, because it puts you in this state of flow that we're all chasing all the time.
Amazing. I want to come back to sanding unless it's too traumatic of a topic to talk about. But I guess, like, one of the pieces I started to ask you when we were in the hall was, I haven't read a ton about automation in the field of dendrochronology. And so when I think about a tree like Adonis with 1,000 years, but particularly to some of your colleagues working on a 5,000-year-old tree, like, what is counting? Like, I've done a few myself as an amateur, and eventually I get stuck, or I forget a number, or I run against 10 rings that I can't count, and I say, and I go back. What does that look like?
Yeah, so I think, of course, people are exploring AI options with tree rings, but to be honest, and I think maybe that's to our advantage. The field work, you're not going to do with AI. The sanding, you're not going to do with AI. The preparation of the samples, you're not going to do with AI. So that is all the most labor-intensive part you can't replace. And then the cross-dating. So there have been improvements, definitely, not just with automation, or actually less so with automation as with imagery and with storing very large and being able to store very large, very heavy images, because you need really high resolution for these very narrow rings to be able to store them, to record them, and then store them so that you can work on the images rather than on the wood itself directly. And that has improved the process, or the efficiency of the process, quite a bit.
Yeah, no, certainly, like, the best I've been able to do is throw it into one of our CAD type programs to at least put a tick on every line so that I can keep coming back. After
that, we can also do it with pens in the wood.
That works too. Let's go there. I mean, in some of our first emails back and forth, but also in the book, you've said a version of trees remember, they record history, and they don't lie. We need to correctly interpret the stories trees tell us. We need to read their ring patterns with the attention they deserve. I've been super interested. I mean, I imagine most scientific fields have more interpretation and creativity than most of us think. But it feels like in dendrochronology, it feels like in hearing you on this podcast, like there's a level of interpretation and creativity to your field to need to be able to jump between or throw assumptions at things that I guess I would just be interested to hear you talk about creativity in science in your field. Like, how do you see yourself as a creative person?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. I think you're right that with all fields of science, scientists are often seen as these data-driven, facts-driven people who it's either right or wrong. But the creative aspect of science is so often overlooked. You don't come up with new theories. You don't come up with new stories unless you have a creative mind. And so the way the scientific process works is that you put a hypothesis out there, and when you interpret your results so that you create a new theory for other people to disprove you, to prove you wrong. That's the whole idea of the process. Like when I'm writing a paper that, I use strings to reconstruct climate during the Roman Empire, and I find that climate change has contributed to the fall of Rome. That is to the extent of my knowledge based on the data that I collected, but I don't know what other data. I hope more data on that topic will be collected by other people that will either provide nuance to the theory that I put out there, or that will prove me wrong, or that will support my theory. But the idea that we find something and that is then the absolute truth and there's no wiggle room, that's not how science works. Now, of course, if 99% of the scientists find the same thing and no one has been able to prove them wrong, as for instance the case with CO2 causing our atmosphere to warm up, that's then scientific evidence that piles up. But I'm getting further away from the creative bit. But I think that being said, so dendrochronology is a very interdisciplinary science. I already showed its application in human history, in climate history, in forest history, in eco-history. They're so closely linked, and it's that connection that we need moving forward. It's when addressing climate change, it's not about a changing climate. It's about how it will impact us, our society. This is what we should be concerned about. It's about how it impacts our ecosystems and how these changes in the ecosystems then feed back, as you mentioned with the carbon cycle, feed back into that changing climate. So understanding all of these interlinked fields is core to our science of dendrochronology.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really great answer. One of the areas I've been curious, there's a couple of sort of types of tree I'm curious to pose whether you or colleagues have had much reason to go to. One of them particularly, and this sort of leads to a second question, so forgive, but I'm curious whether you've had any reason to sample plantation-grown conifers. So thinking, I guess for those less familiar, fast-grown, short-lived trees. Is there any reason dendrochronologists would have cared to?
Yes, not the sort of dendrochronologist that I am. I'm a dendroclimatologist, meaning that I look for the oldest possible trees and also trees that grow in a natural environment. But a very important application of tree ring research nowadays is in the study of the carbon cycle, in understanding how much carbon or how much trees and forests help in addressing the CO2 problem that we're dealing with. And there, of course, understanding how fast plantation trees grow, what their life cycle is, how much carbon they can store, whether all of these, how they react under a warming climate, how they react under a drying climate, all of these things are important for our future, which species to best plant when you plant and so forth.
Oh, that's so interesting, because that's certainly, instinctually is not where I think my mind was headed. One of the thoughts, knowing that I'd have a chance to pose questions to you, that has just been rattling around my brain is sort of thinking a few hundred years in the future, and not necessarily just because of impending climate doom. So thinking the best possible scenario, 300 years from now, we're all still doing good and building and things have worked well. The way we're building recently is increasingly building with fast-grown timber that's lived pretty short lives and often goes into buildings that won't necessarily stand up for too long. And so, assuming all has gone well, and this is a purely archaeological question, I'm curious to think about a dendrochronologist 300 years from now, in that I hear you talk about building pieces of oak beams that have been alive for 300 years, and I'm kind of picturing an impossible task of sort of doing this chronodating with kind of like 2-year overlaps, because every tree has only. So I guess in a totally fictional world, like I'm curious to hear what you think it means for us sort of like not writing any history through our buildings.
Oh, that's so interesting. I did not see that question coming. But it is fascinating. It is true that we need a number of rings to be able to do the cross dating. Of course, if you have 3 wide rings out of 30, that doesn't mean anything. It could date to any year. So you need enough rings to do so. You also need it's such a good question. You also need enough variety in the rings. So you can't have a plantation grown or an irrigated tree because all of the rings will be the same width, and so there's no pattern in them. That being said, even though those old growth, the buildings in Europe, especially, but also here, that were built from old growth trees, and that now still that we can still date now. I'd rather be dating the old growth trees by coring by taking a sample out of them while the tree is still alive than having a beam of wood somewhere. So I think if building with young plantation wood allows us to grow old growth forests again, I think I'd prefer that. Yeah.
That solves it. Let's do it. I think probably 2 more, and then let's throw it over, because I hope that there's some interesting questions and I haven't exhausted them all. I'm often asked in contexts like this what my favorite tree is. And I inevitably stumble through a version of saying that's impossible. So I'd like to do a slight favor and instead ask, I'm curious if you would have an answer to what the tree that you're the most interested in is, rather than your favorite.
Scientifically speaking?
Your choice.
Well, I mean, as someone who works with wood, I would say that the broadleaf trees are so much more interesting than the coniferous trees. That being said, coniferous trees grow to be a lot older. And then, I mean, in dendrochronology, I've sketched I hope a very clear, very straightforward picture of what it is like in temperate trees. You go to the tropics, the situation is very, very different. And so I think there is a pioneering work to be done with studying the trees in the rainforest with new techniques, not just image analysis, but new, you can study the chemistry of the wood, you can study the density of the wood with exploring. Because tropical trees often don't form annual rings. They don't have a winter season, so they don't hibernate in winter, which means they don't necessarily show in annual rings. But they do slow down their growth. Some stop growing, but you don't necessarily see it with your visually. But exploring the ways, I think there's so much that we need to learn still about tropical trees that I think that would be. But that's very general, of course. If I had to pick one tropical tree, maybe a baobab. Yeah, that's phenomenal. Yeah,
I'd accept that. That's a very cool tree. I want to choose to interpret part of what you've just answered as sort of what you might like to see more dendrochronologists doing in the next while. As a last question, what would you like to see designers and builders do?
I'm with you on this one. I think wood is such a phenomenal material. It is live material, which makes it really hard to work with. I understand that. But if you think of, wood as a trees as a carbon capturing machine, you can plant a tree if it's becomes 100 years old, it will capture carbon for 100 years while it is alive. But as soon as a tree dies, unless you do something with its wood, the carbon is going to go straight back into the atmosphere. So using wood as a building material in a long-lasting way is also a way to store carbon over the long term, and I think that's something that's not being thought of enough. And the life cycle hasn't been of going from trees to buildable wood material is probably needs still a lot of improvement, but I think there's a lot to be done there. And I think just again, it's such a beautiful material. There's so much you can do with that. I'd like to see much more design with wood. Yeah.
I'll take it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question.
So we're going to open this up to the audience just for a few minutes, if that's all right. 5 or 10 minutes of questions. Maybe I'll kick it off. I'm actually interested in and this is a question for both of you, but in the role of in the human network, either in dendrochronology or in let's say alternative wood futures, because I think they depend on sharing data, basically. Like for both of your practices, on one side, obviously, to construct a deep cross-dating history, you need to share information to different communities of scientists across different regions, and also, with these novel tree parts, I think we need new kinds of basically data in order to know what we can use when. I mean, the reason we use standard wood parts in architecture is because we can quickly understand, how to build something out of either dimensional lumber or mass timber. So I feel like the challenge is not just kind of ideas and authorship or creativity, but it's also just how do we empower like the human network to share more and create like more data that we can use.
I have an answer, but I talked a lot already, so you want to go?
I think it's so important because it's certainly in the space I've worked in, and for the first 4 years after the Tree Fork Trust, I went around and said, forks, 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 get rid of your glue lamb. That's the worst thing. Like, build the future with forks, and like the future isn't just forks. And so much of the subtlety, I think, has come from seeing the need for a ton more people, the need for a ton more projects, and the need to somehow resolve exactly that question, which is not everybody's going to have a robotic arm. Not everybody's going to have 10 French trained carpenters to do the work of a robot without it. And yet at the same time, we can't always resort to the kind of cheapest approach. And so for me, there's this kind of impossible challenge of how do we not try to go back to artisanal craft as the kind of celebrated one-off project? How do we bring it back? And yet how do we not lose sight of the fact that as much as we hate it, like the 2x4 frame is really clever. And so that I think in my work, there's been a lot more subtlety recently of trying not to be so absolute in what's good, what's bad, but like everything is about energy. And so that the one piece has been trying to have conversations that say, if we can do more with less, that's it.
Yeah, I didn't mention this at all, but there's in tree rings, it's ridiculously important, the people network. So on the one hand, there is a database of the measurements, where most dendrochronologists are quite sociable, and so people can upload their data once they've measured and been published and make publicly available, which allows for people like me. I didn't talk about it, but actually my main research focus is the reconstruction of atmospheric dynamics of processes like the jet stream that happen high up in the atmosphere. You cannot do that based on one data point. You need to collect data from a lot of regions. And so if other people have already collected those data, it makes life easier and makes your science go a lot faster. Similarly, with the archaeology and the art history dating, you need a reference chronology to be able to put a date. You need a chronology where the most recent ring is a year that the tree was cored in order to be able to date a piece of wood of unknown history that's undated. And so you need, you can yourself go core all those trees, but if you're an archaeologist, that's not your job. So depending on the network there, and what's really cool there is just one example is that we can not only date, for instance, oak panels of paintings, but we can also provenance where the wood came from. So you can compare the chronology that you find in that oak panel to a whole lot of reference chronologies all over Europe, and then see where is the best match, not just where all it matches, but what geographic region is the best match. And so you can say that painting from the Weide that was painted by a Flemish primitive, the oak wood actually came from Poland or something like that. So that's a nice application that's only possible through networks, as you mentioned.
Thank you. So I'm going to do the job of passing the mic around if there's any other questions. Yeah, Brandon.
Thank you both for sharing tonight. I had the pleasure of listening to Zach give a lecture on this in the past in Toronto, and with your expertise, it really brought another level to his context, and also, just appreciating kind of a more purely scientific aspect of it. Opened my eyes to a lot. So Zach mentioned or asked you about any misconceptions that you have surrounding trees, and I guess their place in architecture and at large. Also bringing up about kind of these fast growing pieces of wood or trees that are then used for a lot of nominal lumber. I'm wondering if you can speak to presently any misconceptions about wood as a regenerative building material, and that if that's used at times as maybe an umbrella term to cover up some other kind of less appropriate or more energy inefficient methods of building that go into that combination. Just hearing both of you talk about kind of reclaimed woods and then also this like new fast growing approach to producing lumber elements for architecture, for energy, kind of the whole gestalt of it. I'm interested to hear if there's any layers of misconception on kind of wood as regenerative material as well.
First, I think I can speak more. I'm not an architect. I think reclaimed wood, is an outstanding. I mean, it's also what you that photo of the beams in the parking lot. That was awesome. I think that is a largely underused source, and I'm really in favor of that as part of the circular economy. The only way we're going to be able to address the climate change issue we're dealing with is by making our economy more circular and in building. But again, I'm not an architect. I'm not in that field. Correct me if I'm wrong. But I see that as a very valuable. Again, much more research needs to be done about it, but I think it can be a very valuable contribution to the circular economy. When it comes to plantation and afforestation, as we call it, planting new forests, I have a lot of thoughts. I'm not sure you want to hear them all, but I think it is often proposed as a simple and relatively cheap solution to a very big problem, which is we need to get carbon out of the atmosphere. It's true that trees do that, but planting new forests and replacing old growth forests, cutting down old trees and saying, okay, we'll just plant new ones is not, it is much more complicated than that. And I'll just paint a picture in a broad picture, but I showed you the forest fires. So, in a warming climate, we will have more forest fires, and trees only capture carbon as long as they're alive. As soon as one fire goes through those forests, that's it. All of your effort, all of your years of carbon capture are gone. Trees only capture carbon as long as they are alive. Once they're dead, there's no more, it all literally goes up the air all at once, all the CO2. So, and this is something that has happened in recent years. You fly United or any other airline, they give you the option to offset your carbon footprint. They do that by planting forests in Oregon that have all gone up in air because of the drought and the forest fire. So it's a scam. It's a scam, to be honest. The carbon offset of flying through planting forest. It is a scam, I'm going to be honest about it. Secondly, apart from the fact that under a changing climate, it's a very risky thing to do. There's no evidence that you can actually continue to capture that carbon. Two, the capacity of trees to capture carbon under a hotter and drier climate goes down. So already in Europe, Swedish forests, German forests are putting more carbon in the atmosphere than they are capturing at this point, existing forests, right? So the idea that with a forest you will capture carbon, it's not that clear. Thirdly, I can keep going. With planting forests,
Please.
well, forests, trees need water, they need land, and guess who else needs water and land? People, right? So where are you going to plant all those forests? How are you going to keep them alive? Planting forests is like making kids, right? The planting part is easy. It's the keeping them alive and making them into concerned citizens. That is the hard part. And no one talks about that. I don't know. Maybe leave it up.
Yeah.
Anything you want to add, Zach?
Super short. I mean, I think you've touched, without being an architect, so many of the key points. Like, I feel like the simplest addition to that is just like none of the building solutions we need are as simple as we want to talk about them as though they are. That there's forests that emit carbon, and therefore wood buildings made from those forests emit carbon. From my experience, that applies to every single building material that we're seeing as regenerative or otherwise. And so I think it's that, like, we need to know where our material came from, who cut it down, how it was treated, where it got to us, how far it was transported. And we need to somehow do all of that without adding so much computational power that we have data centers that are also then compounding it. And so, like, it's not to make it sound impossible, but I think we need to be better at knowing that we've set ourselves like a damn near impossible task in the days ahead, but that shouldn't stop us.
Great.
Thank you, Jared.
Maybe if you're thinking of one last question, I just want to remind everyone of the reception we're having across the street. So please come and enjoy some
Food and wood.
some food, and yeah, and some wood. Last question here.
Hi, thank you both so much. This was very informative. Unfortunately, Zach, I primarily do glue lamb, and not forks. But I'm wondering if you were to transition from the scale of projects that you currently engage with and think at the scale of glue lamb and CLT, are there ways to begin working with a more bespoke approach to individual pieces of wood, potentially combining multiple species, for example? I'm co-teaching a studio with McKenna McKecka this semester, and so we're talking about that as a possibility. Like, what if you have these multi-species approaches to mass timber or other ways to work with found or limited quantities of material instead of this more anonymized approach to the wood that becomes our building products. Do you have thoughts on how you could sort of overcome differences in material properties, or even just the great amount of time it takes to process these differing source materials?
It's a great question. There's some colleagues, like, as just like a project to Google, RAWLAM, RAWLAM is a really nice project from some European colleagues looking to at least use live edge, rounded over, or cuts of wood sandwiched together. And so I think for me, that's always been a piece in my mind of just, I think fundamentally, if we can use worse and worse timber, but have mechanical processes that ensure that both every single gram that we're cutting is used, but also that we're doing less to it. So I think, like, anything that can do more with poor pieces of wood, the better. Part of that requires asking people to change their aesthetic kind of assumptions, because they'll have knobbly bits and they'll be a bit weird. But for me, that adds character. I think if there was one lesson I would channel through like everything, because you're right, like it's not all round, it can't all be forks, it can't be any of these. But I think going back to remembering, like, there's wood buildings, particularly in Europe, that you stand underneath and think, how the hell is that still standing? Right? Like 2x4s this big holding up spans that are 50 meters. And you think, why is our buildings code so concerned that wood is so weak? And there's obvious reasons, like we have to be safe, but there's not enough math being done to compare safety on a global perspective, to me, with safety on a building code perspective. And so I don't say that because I think it's easy to talk about buildings falling down, but that I think it's important to talk about how we bring ourselves closer to being comfortable with buildings that are like just strong enough, super well calculated, incredibly immaculately considered. But the first thing I would love to do is get rid of the term mass timber, because it starts from the assumption that we need bulk. And so I think if we could do anything to bring kind of thinner materials, more ambitious spans, natural curvature that allows fewer grams of like any way to bring any of those smarts to big buildings, all while knowing that we're going to touch 100 really difficult topics when we start talking about dodgy buildings. But I don't know, we need more dodgy buildings again. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you very much. That was incredible.